In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Probably one of the most well-known scriptures in the Bible. I'm pushing this thing forward. Probably one of the most well-known scriptures, because even for anyone who starts to read the Bible, they at least get that far. And maybe not much further, but they at least get that far. So they know this scripture. It seems rather straightforward. God created it all. And it goes on to talk about the days of creation. But there are many questions that it brings up to mind as well. And many have actually looked at this creation account and decided they cannot believe in the Bible, because they cannot believe what Christians say happened there in Genesis chapter 1. How long ago did it happen? Is there any evidence of that? Many people will reject the Bible because of that question. Because if it all happened 6,000 years ago, how did all this that we see, how did the light from the stars get here so quickly? I mean, the closest star is 4 light years away, I suppose. If the universe is so young, how do we see so many stars? They're so far away. These questions come to mind. How do we get some of the formations that we have, the rock formations that seem to have taken so long? Of course, people have gone to great lengths to provide answers to some of these things. But many people look at that and say, well, it can't, if the Bible says it's 6,000 years old, I just can't believe that. I can't accept the Bible. Well, what does the Bible say about that? Did God create the earth through evolution? Were the days of creation one day, did it equal thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, millions of years? Were they literal days or not? So there are a lot of questions that come to mind when we read this, and there's a lot of different opinions about what exactly happened. Let's take a look at that today. I'd like to just discuss the creation account and see what the Bible really says. How can we answer some of these questions about it? I think, first of all, it's important to go back, all the way back to the very beginning. If we go to John chapter 1, because John tells us what happened even before creation, before anything was created. John chapter 1, and beginning in verse 1. Talking here about the ultimate beginning. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now further in verse 14, we know the Word became flesh, so speaking here of Jesus Christ. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. And so we have from this particular verse, we know that God the Father, and the one that became Jesus Christ, referred to as the Word here, existed before anything else existed. And we know that if anything was made, it was made by the Word, by the one who became Jesus Christ. I know over the years there has been speculation that perhaps angels created things, but the Bible tells us the Word, if it was made by the Word. We could go to Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 9, where it says that God who created all things through Jesus Christ. So God the Father created all things through the Word, the one who became Jesus Christ. And let's turn back to Colossians chapter 1 for another evidence of this. Before the creation account in Genesis was God the Father and the Word. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 16. We'll just pick up in verse 15. It says, he is, talking of Christ here, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things consist. So we have here again, even the angels dominions, principalities. It was created through Jesus Christ. Now, sometimes people wonder about the firstborn. It says he was in the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. It doesn't mean that he was born literally. It's speaking here of the biblical sense of the firstborn having preeminence in the family. And Christ was the one firstborn from the dead and resurrected, and he will have preeminence. It doesn't mean that Jesus was created. It clearly says that all things that were created were made by him. So I think that's important to note, first of all. And we also, if we turn back to Job chapter 38, we see at the time the earth was created, the angels already existed. So the angels were created first, and then the earth, and from that we can suppose the rest of the universe, the rest of the material universe that we see. Job chapter 38, verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measure? Surely you know, God asking Job these questions to humble him. Or stretched out the line upon it. To what were its foundations fastened? You know, how did the earth come to be? It said, who laid its cornerstone? Verse 7, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So when the earth was created, we have the evidence here that the angels were very pleased about that. And evidently from other places, we see that God had given the angels, some of the angels at least, the earth, something to do here. Again, you can speculate and have speculated in the past about what exactly did they do, but evidently some of them were given responsibility on earth. And that's part of the reason probably that we see them shouting for joy. If we go back to Isaiah 14, there's several scriptures that indicate that the angels rebelled, and they had been and were on earth, and certainly after their rebellion, the earth was what they were limited to. Isaiah chapter 14, and picking up in verse 12, it says, how are you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? You have been cut down to the ground. So he fell from heaven, he came to earth. It says, you who weaken the nations, for you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of gods. Notice this concept of ascending seems to give the impression from earth into heaven. He had a throne. He had some kind of responsibility in the angelic realm. He had a throne, but he wanted to exalt that throne above that of God's. He wanted to sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. He said, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So again, we see a description above the heights of the clouds indicates that he was here. That at that time Lucifer, and as we know a third of the angels, likely again had some responsibility on earth. And that wasn't enough. They wanted more. And hence we have the angelic rebellion. We know that all this took place before the Garden of Eden, before Adam and Eve, because of course, the serpent was there already, cunning and trying to get them to go a different direction. So all this angelic rebellion and creation happened before the creation week that we see in Genesis. And I think that's important to get that background as we understand the account. Now we can go back to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, again, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So we know he created. When did this happen? It says the earth was without form and void. I think many have heard over the years those Hebrew words. The earth was tohu and bohu. It says, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. We'll talk about that, but that is the location of the Spirit as this story of creation is being told. Now, I think as I said, most of you know that the word tohu in Hebrew, translated without form, can mean waste, desert, emptiness, formlessness, vanity, even nothingness. And bohu can mean emptiness and void and waste and desolation. And we oftentimes will go back to Isaiah chapter 45, where this word, in this case, tohu, is used in Isaiah 45 and verse 18, where it tells us that, thus says the Lord who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, there is no other. This word, who did not create it in vain, the word vain is tohu. And so we look back at that verse, and it's telling us that the earth was created. It wasn't created a desolation. It was created to be inhabited. God created a wonderful and beautiful creation. God is not the author of confusion. But this doesn't satisfy some, because the word tohu and bohu can be used to represent just emptiness. And so when God created the earth, it just could be empty. They will say, well, it doesn't mean that it had to be desolation or destroyed or anything like that. It could just mean it wasn't inhabited yet. And, well, perhaps that's the case. The word tohu and bohu is not used together in the Bible except in one other place. If you go back to Jeremiah chapter 4, we have this without form and void used by the prophet Jeremiah. Bohu is only used in a very few places, I think 3, if I remember correctly. But tohu and bohu is only used together in this one other place, Jeremiah chapter 4, and we'll pick up in verse 22. This is Jeremiah writing about God's judgment on Judah, and how this beautiful land of Judah is going to look after God's judgment upon them. Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 22, it says, "For my people are foolish. They have not known me. They are silly children. They have no understanding. They are wise to do evil, but they do not. To do good they have no knowledge. I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void." Now, again, this is beholding the landscape after Judah is destroyed. And notice he goes on to say, the heavens, they had no light. Now, clearly at the time that Judah was taken over, there was a sun. But he's indicating here that sunlight, because of the darkness and the cover, whatever was in the atmosphere because of the destruction, was not getting through. The heavens, they had no light. If you looked up, you wouldn't see the light that you normally would expect to see. The heavens had no light. I beheld the mountains, and indeed they trembled, and all the hills moved back and forth. I beheld, and indeed there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens had fled. I beheld, and indeed the fruitful land was a wilderness, and all the cities were broken down at the presence of the Lord by his fierce anger. So we see here a situation where things had been wonderful, but because of their sin and their rebellion, it changed into desolation. And I think it's noteworthy here that that's the only other place where tohu and bohu is used. It's used in a sense of something that was wonderful, but became something different. Became something different. And so evidently when we put these scriptures together, tohu and bohu means more than just being empty, but it means wasteland, a waste, something that had become that way. So we can go back to Genesis chapter 1 again. And as we've understood over the years, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth became. We oftentimes have said the word was, tohu and bohu, can mean became, tohu and bohu. It became desolation, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And so the way we've understood this over the years is God created the heavens and the earth. They were wonderful. It seems as though the angels had a responsibility on earth. And at their rebellion, what we have thought is that rebellion, that there would have been a destructiveness. They were bent on destruction. And the earth became a very different place after their rebellion. The Hebrew word for was is used several times in the book of Genesis itself and translated became. So if you have an NIV, I think NIV and some of the other Bibles will have a marginal note that word can mean became as well. One example is Genesis 2, verse 7, where it says, God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became. Hayah is the Hebrew word, became a living creature. He wasn't a living creature before, but he became that. In chapter 9, verse 15, it says the waters no longer will no longer become a flood. He will not flood the entire earth again and kill all the life. Will not become a flood. And also Lot's wife in Genesis 19, verse 26, Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. So we have the same word used in various places there, and it can mean very easily be translated as became. I want to read to you, first of all, this concept that the earth was created perhaps long before God spoke the words, "Let there be light," is not a new concept. It's not something that the church came to its own understanding about some years ago. This interpretation of the earth becoming a wasteland goes back some 2,000 years, where rabbis discussed this kind of thing. It's actually attributed to Jewish sages in the 2nd century. One of the Aramaic versions of the Old Testament, in Genesis 1, verse 2, it says the earth was laid waste. This is back near the time of Christ. It was laid waste. It became that way. And so it's a very common thought over the years. There is one particular author here. I've got an article written by Mr. Paul Lukey, and he has this quote that I found interesting regarding the idea of the earth being created well, but then becoming without form and void, becoming a wasteland. He says that perhaps the best treatment of both sides of this question is given by the late author Custance in his book, Without Form and Void, a study of the meaning of Genesis 1, verse 2. It says, Dr. Custance states, to me, this issue is important. And after studying the problem for some 30 years, and after reading everything I could lay my hands on, pro and con, and after accumulating in my own library some 200 commentaries on Genesis, I am persuaded that there is, on the basis of the evidence, far more reason to translate Genesis 1, verse 2, but the earth had become a ruin and desolation, than there is for any of the conventional translations in our modern versions. So I found that quote interesting. This gentleman who'd studied it diligently for many years came to the conclusion that this was the most reasonable approach. Now, so I say that because I don't want us to think that we just came up with that on our own. It is something that has long been viewed. But many of the evangelicals believed that the earth is 6,000 years old, maybe 6,000 to 10,000, and they discount or have explanations for the science that seems to indicate a much older earth. And again, this is one of the reasons that some people, they think to be a Christian, you have to believe that. They don't know that there's another way of looking at it. Where did this idea come from? Well, originally, the idea of the earth being 6,000 years old comes from the idea of counting the genealogies that we find in the Bible. If you count the lives that people lived and when they would have lived, you count back, you get somewhere around 6,000 years. Bishop Ussher was one of the early ones to come to the conclusion the earth was created in 4004 BC. Some others will say it could have been longer. It depends on how you count the generations. But nowhere in the Bible does it tell us how old the earth is. People come to that conclusion again because of the genealogies. And I think over the years the church has certainly given the fact that that mankind was created around 6,000 years ago. That fits God's plan in many ways. 6 days of man, a 6,000 years of man to have his time before the millennium begins. And the generations seem to go back into that time frame as well. So we would have no problem with man's existence on the earth 6,000 years. But again, the idea of the earth. Earth, was it old, or do we have to discount the science? And we don't. Bottom line is the Bible, there's no reason that we have to say that the earth is only 6,000 years old. It could, according to the Bible, certainly be older than that. Go back to Genesis. We see the account. I'd like to delve a little more into the account itself, and then we'll explain a little more about it. But it says in verse 1, of course, God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was or became without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." So we note that when God began his creative work here, the first day creating light, I put in quotes, creating light, we see that the earth was already here. The waters of the deep was here when God said the words, "Let there be light." The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the earth. God had already created the heavens and the earth, and here we get to that first creation day, and he says, "Let there be light." And God saw the light, that it was good. He divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And evening and morning were the first day. Now, verse 6 talks about that God said, "Let there be a firmament," or we might say an expanse, "in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so, and God called the firmament heaven, or some translations will say sky. It's translated both heaven and sky. So the evening and morning were the second day. I think I'll pause just a minute to talk a little bit about this word firmament and this idea, because it's an interesting history of how people came to understand the firmament. Now, in our English language, firmament is something firm. And so to us, it seems to be saying that God created something solid there in the sky. The sky is solid. Of course, we know that it's not, but did they believe that it was? The origination of this word firmament came from Jerome when he translated the Latin Vulgate. He had the Greek Septuagint to use, and back when the Septuagint was created, when they translated the Hebrew into Greek, the Greeks believed in a solid heaven. And so, for that word, the Hebrew word, that we have the word firmament, they chose a word that implied something solid, which was very much in line with what the Greeks thought. The heavens were solid. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. And when Jerome translated his Latin Vulgate, he saw that Greek word, which implied solidness, and he translated it firmamentum, or however you say that in Latin, and that's directly where we get the word firmament. And so it came to be something that was solid. Question is did the Hebrews believe that it was a solid sky? And that is something that is debated even to this day. When you look at the history of how the sky, or we could say the cosmos, has been viewed over the history, typically in the 19th century, around the 19th, 20th century, early 20th century, when they had this pan-Babylonian craze, it was referred to that way, as they were discovering all these things about Babylon, ancient Babylon. And of course, the Jews had been captive in Babylon. And so many scholars began to teach that, the Jews got all their beliefs from Babylon. And when they came out of captivity, they wrote this Bible. They created characters like Moses and David to give them a history. But actually what the Bible reflects is Babylonian culture and Babylonian ideas. And that became very, very prominent way of thinking in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And they thought at the time that the Babylonians believed in a domed earth. They believed that Babylonians might have thought of the earth as flat and there was a solid dome over it. And so many times when you read Bible dictionaries and various things, you'll see pictures of what they say the Hebrews believed. That the earth was flat and there was a solid bowl over it. It was solid dome, and you had the waters underneath, which were the primeval waters underneath the earth, and outside of that dome, it was full of water too. So space is not space, space is a bunch of water. And there's a dome, a solid, some would say metal dome, that's holding all that water back. And people will laugh at the Hebrews being so silly, you know. And of course, that concept was very prominent in the 19th, early 20th centuries, until they began to see that that wasn't really what the Babylonians believed. You'll still see those pictures, but they came later to see that the Babylonians really didn't believe that. Babylonians, in their writings, they believed in like 6 layers of heavens above the earth. Not a dome, but 6 layers. And that could have been solid, but they were layers. And then later on, the Greeks, who had a very big influence on Jewish writing at the time, and the Jews, and we know from the time of Jesus Christ, there were controversies about how much Greek culture, you know, do we allow ourselves to be Hellenized by Greek thoughts, Greek dress, Greek ideas, Greek teachings? And there were some Jews who were all for it. They accepted Greek clothing, Greek games, and even Greek beliefs. The Greeks believed that the Greeks knew that the earth was round because there's writings about them seeing ships going over the horizon. They knew that the earth was round, but they believed that the cosmos consisted of several layers of spheres around the earth. The earth was right in the middle, but there were layers of solid crystal, they oftentimes would describe it. These layers, like big balls, layers of balls, each bigger than the other. And that's how the earth was in the center of all this. And we have writings from that time. The writer of 1 Enoch goes into some very interesting descriptions of heaven. And he's not just using figurative language, he's describing these solid layers, just like the Greeks believed. And there were windows that would open up. And the sun would come through the one window, through a solid substance, through a gate, and pass across the sky and enter or exit through another gate. And depending on what season it was, there was a different gate that opened that allowed the sun through and the moon to pass through. And so we have this elaborate description of a Greek concept of the heaven. It was solid. And so we see that in the writings. And many of the church fathers had similar views, that there were layers out there. But this concept was accepted as something that was passed back to the Hebrews. But when we actually take a look at the Hebrew Bible, there's less evidence to support anything solid. In fact, it's quite possible that the ancient Hebrews actually believed that they didn't really know what was out there. But they didn't. If you were to show them a picture that we might have today in a Bible dictionary of a dome over a flat earth and the waters outside in space, the waters underneath it, many believe that they wouldn't recognize that as what they believed. That this was basically a creation of the 19th, 20th century scholars because they misinterpreted what the Babylonians believed, and they thought that the Babylonian view was what the Hebrews accepted. So I think it's important to understand that history, that there was very much a craze to blame everything that the Jews taught on what they brought out of Babylon. And once they started learning that the Babylonians didn't really believe that, they began to have to backtrack on that. So you don't see that quite so much today. Now, it is true that the Hebrew word firmament, it's used to represent the pounding out of something, the spreading out of something. Like you might pound gold and spread it out. But there are places where it's used referring to earth and not necessarily heaven or the skies. So it's probably speaking more of God spreading out the heavens than trying to indicate that it's a piece of metal of some type. I think sometimes scholars have gone too far in trying to say it's solid out there. In fact, they would say that the early Hebrews believed that when it rains, it's because gates, the windows of heaven are being opened, and the rain from out in space is allowed to come down to earth. And so that's where rain comes from. Now, they will look at the account of Genesis or the flood and say where it says the gates of heaven, the windows of heaven were opened, and say, see, they believed that it was something solid holding back this water, and when those windows opened, the rain came down. And that can simply be a figure of speech. We say when it's raining hard, it's raining cats and dogs. But maybe someone 2,000 years from now looks back and thinks that we actually thought cats and dogs were raining. When we don't. It's just an illustration. The heavens opening up. We have many scriptures in the Old Testament that show us that the Hebrews knew that rain came from clouds, sky, the firmament, but it wasn't solid. There are many of it. Think of Elijah looking out, seeing the little cloud developing when he knows rain is going to be coming. He sees the cloud. It gets bigger and bigger. The Hebrews knew that rain came from clouds. To think that the Hebrews thought that the windows of some solid firmament were opening to let the rains of space down on us really is going too far. It's attributing to them a belief that I don't believe they had, and really when you see what they actually believed, you see what's written, you see that they understood the clouds produced the rain. So I thought I'd just mention a little bit about the firmament there. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 9, it talks about the dry land appearing and the vegetation, the seas being divided, fruit trees on the third day. And then verse 14, it talks about the sun, moon, and stars. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament, the heavens of the heavens, to divide the day from the night. And he says, let them be as signs and see for the seasons and for days and years. So they had a purpose. And he had the greater light, the firmament. He said, for the lights in the firmament of heaven to give light to the earth. And it was so, and God made two great lights, the lesser one, the greater one to rule the day, and the lesser one the night. And he also made stars. And he set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth and to rule over the day and over the night. Divided the light from darkness, and saw that it was good. And in verse 20, created the sea creatures, and the birds, which it says the birds flew above the earth across the face of the firmament. This is one of the scriptures some will use to say that the firmament wasn't seen as solid because the birds are flying across it. And they would have recognized that the birds aren't running into things up there. It says, and God created the sea creatures on the fifth day, and then, of course, land animals, verse 24 and 25, land animals, and verse 26, humans. God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish, the sea, and the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing on earth that lives. And, of course, the seventh day he rested, having completed his work on the sixth day, and he rested in the Sabbath. Now, there are several problems with this story that some will point out. Number one, God said, let there be light. But there was no sun until the fourth day. How could there be light without the sun? And people will look at that and say, well, there's a problem here. There's a discrepancy. How do we answer that? I think some of what we've already talked about helps us answer the question. First of all, there are two things to keep in mind. First of all, the earth and the universe and solar system had already been created. We don't know how long ago. Millions of years? We just don't know. But that was probably, as we've thought over the years, the time that the dinosaurs and such roamed the earth. Now, those who believe that the earth is 6,000 years put the dinosaurs, some of them put dinosaurs on the ark and say that they were part of the existence back then, and they have to put the dinosaurs within that 6,000 years. But typically the church has saw that because the earth is older than 6,000, there was plenty of time for the dinosaurs. And perhaps that was some of the role of the angels, who knows? I don't personally believe they created, because it says the Word created all that was created, but they could have been given dominion to care for and maybe perceive how they were going to. Were they going to be loyal to God? Were they not? Would the power of Lucifer go to his head? And it ended up perhaps being a testing ground for the angels during that time. And of course, we know some of them rebelled. But the second key to remember is that creation is told, the story of creation in Genesis is told from the perspective of where the Holy Spirit was, hovering over the face of the waters. It's important to keep that in mind. It's not told from the perspective of outer space. It's not told from the perspective of God's throne. It's told from the perspective of someone, if they had been right there on the face of the waters, as the Holy Spirit was, what they would have seen. And we've mentioned before, a lot of times the Bible uses this kind of approach. A few months ago, I gave a sermonette on the smallest seed. Remember, that was the smallest of the mustard seeds, said by Christ to be the smallest of all seeds, but it's really not. There are other seeds much smaller than the mustard seed. So how can Christ say the smallest of all seeds when it's not? Well, it was the smallest of all seeds that they knew of, that they were aware of. It was the smallest. And so it's from their perspective, this is the smallest of all seeds. And he's talking from their perspective. It would have been useless for him to say a certain plant that they'd never heard of is the smallest seed. God speaks in terms of language that we can understand. And he continues to do that. And when you think about it, this idea of telling a story from the perspective of the earth is biblical, because that's where the Holy Spirit was. Plus, it's been called, let me get this word right, phenomenological language. Phenomenological. In other words, how we see, how we witness things. And it's interesting to think about that. In other words, the sun rises and sets. But what we've learned over time is the earth is revolving. The sun is still relative to the earth, but it's staying still. We're revolving. So some would say, see, the Bible's wrong. There is no sunset. But actually, that language is true forever. To use a phenomenological language to describe the sun setting, it's always true. Doesn't matter how much we learn about the universe, about the sun, about the earth, the sun always seems to set. The sun will always, to every generation on earth, seem to rise. It is the only language he could have used that would have always been true. Man would always experience this in their experience. I think it's important to keep that in mind, that oftentimes much in the Bible is told from that phenomenological point of view. And it's a perspective that remains true forever and for everyone, for all generations. And so it makes sense that would be the type of language God would use, no matter what later generations learned. So let's talk about this idea. Day one, light appears on the earth's surface. And what this very well could have been is from the destruction that happened who knows how long before, the earth's atmosphere was thick with dust, vapor. Evidently, from the Bible, there was a lot of vapor in the atmosphere. And it's interesting that someone sent me an article this week, that scientists they look back and they believe that the earth in its earlier days had a lot of CO2, a lot of carbon dioxide, and a lot of methane, and not near as much oxygen. And they described the atmosphere under those conditions as being very thick, that light unable to penetrate. It's because there is less carbon dioxide and more oxygen today that allows light to penetrate to the degree it does. So even the science has recognized that a different type of atmosphere would prevent light from coming through. So evidently what we see here from a sun that had already been created, earth becoming without form and void, tohu and bohu, God is clearing the atmosphere. So now light can actually get to the face of the earth. If you had been standing there, been alive, suddenly you would be able to tell night and day. It gets dark at night. Now you can't see the sun because the atmosphere is not that clear yet, but you can tell light. Light began to show up on the face of the earth. The second day we have the firmament, the expanse. Evidently, again, more work on the atmosphere, dividing of the lower water and the upper water. If there was a great deal of vapor in the atmosphere, it's very thick with vapor, he would divide where some of the water went low, some of the water went high. What we see as clouds were formed. And probably a preparing of the atmosphere with oxygen, whatever else needed to be prepared for life to exist from whatever it was when it was tohu and bohu. Third day, dividing the water, the dry land and the seas. Grasses and herbs. Create a fourth day. Again, more clearing so that we begin to see the sun and the moon. That's one way to look at this. In other words, now you can actually, when you can see the sun, when the atmosphere is that clear, you can see the sun, you can know when it sets. Before that, it just gets dark. Now you could see, if you had been there, the sun rising. You could see the moon. Its phases. And you could know the seasons. And so remember, it talks about setting them, giving them that role of days, appointing days and seasons. So now, since we can see these bodies, the atmosphere is clear, you can see what phase they're in, whether it's rising or setting or anything like that. Again, creation of birds and fish and land animals, and obviously the Sabbath. So this is the way we've understood it over the years, because the Bible certainly allows for that. The Bible doesn't necessitate a 6,000-year-old earth or a 6 to 10,000-year-old earth. And the idea of light appearing and the sun appearing later isn't in conflict at all. It's just what naturally would happen from chaos in an atmosphere that was very bad and inhospitable to life. What about these days, though? Day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Were they actual 24-hour periods? Even some Christians will say, well, probably long eras of time. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Millions of years, who knows? Is that the way the Bible views it? I think we have to answer the question by going to the Bible, because how do we know otherwise? It's just theoretical answers. The Hebrew word for day can mean a 24-hour period, but it can also mean a very long period of time. We use the same language. We'll say, well, back in the day, we don't mean a 24-hour day. We mean back at a certain time in my life, a period of time. The same thing in the Hebrew. In fact, many of the words in the Hebrew are very general. It can mean something specific or something general. When it says that God set the sun and the moon in the sky, that word set can mean a point or a sign or show forth, cause to show. It doesn't have to mean that he created it that instant. It can just mean he set it forth, he showed it forth. And so a lot of times these Hebrew words can be very general in their use. Let me see here. Okay. Gave this sermon in the South last week, and I got lost at the same place in my notes. Thought I had figured it out, but obviously not. But I know where I am now. So how long were these days? Genesis, the creation account, talks about evening and morning, making it clear that a day as we would understand it was what was meant. There was an evening, there was a morning. The context indicates that it's one rotation of the earth. And it's strange that it would say that and then not mean that. Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8 tells us that it says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth." Points back to that account, and it's treating those as literal days. In 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, and this is the commandment, remember the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth. So that context gives us clearly that in the Bible these were viewed as actual days, not eons of time. Now finally, the last question that I wanted to address today was the idea of theistic evolution. We talked about this some years ago, but is it possible that God created life as we know it through the process of evolution? And some Christians who believe this, they call it theistic evolution. Is it possible that God created all things, life today, through the process of evolution? The answer is yes. Anything's possible with God, right? The question is it compatible with Scripture? That's the real question. Does the Scripture indicate that that is what happened? I think when we really look at it, we find the Scriptures contrary to the idea of theistic evolution. One of them is in Genesis 1, verse 26. We read that earlier. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." God didn't create man from other animals. He created man from the dust of the ground and in his image. So the indication here is that it wasn't evolution, that the creation of man was a distinct point in time, and God wanted man to be created in his image. Clearly distinct from the animal world, not a part of the animal world that had just evolved into what God now thinks he can call man. It was created clear distinction. In other words, the Bible does not support the idea that man came from apes. The Genesis account tells us we were specifically created in his image. What about what Jesus believed? Matthew chapter 19 and verse 4. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 4. Jesus gives the indication of his belief about this. It says, "And he answered, he said to them, 'Have you not read?'" First of all, he's referring to the authority of the Genesis account. "Have you not read? He who made them at the beginning," at this point in time, "made them male and female." So they were literally made male and female, just as the account says, not as they evolved through time. Christ believed the account was to be taken at face value. What about the Apostle Paul? What did he teach regarding this? In Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, verse 26. If evolution were the case, if mankind just evolved from evolution, there would have been, at some point, many creatures that evolved into what we know today as man. But here we see in Acts chapter 7, verse 26, that from one man, he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. So all nations came from one man, the one that God created in Genesis, not from many animals that were human-like, that just went on to reproduce all nations. He says it literally came from one man. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45 says, "So it is written," again, reference to face value, Genesis account, "it's written that the first man, Adam, became a living being, and the last Adam," referring to Christ, "became a life-giving spirit." He believed that there was a first man, Adam, just as we find in the creation account. And also he says in 1 Timothy 2, verse 13, "For Adam was formed first and then Eve." He believed, again, face value, Adam was formed first. An interesting verse in 1 Corinthians 11 kind of puts a nail in the whole subject, I think. 1 Corinthians, a nail in the coffin, I guess I should say. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 8 and 9. It says here, For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Now, if God had used evolutionary process to bring about mankind, all men would have come from woman. The only way that man did not come from woman was that God literally created him independent of the animal creation, and then literally created Eve from that man. It's the only way that this is true. And so what we find is that the concept of God using evolution simply doesn't match with what the other places in the Bible say. We can read the creation account for what it says, that there was indeed 6 days where God created. Seventh day, he rested. We find that account authoritatively referred to in the Bible. How old was the earth? We don't know. But it doesn't have to be 6,000 years old. We don't have to toss the science that has explained it that way out the window. The earth could have been much, much older before God actually said, "Let there be light." I think it's important that we understand origins. And as we can see, a simple creation account can bring many questions to bear, and has for many years. So I hope in looking through this, we can, again, for most of us, we're rehearsing some of the things we already know, but I wanted to go into a little more depth on it so that really understand what we've taught over the years and why we believe it. It's not some idea we just came up with, but there have been those who thought these things for many, many years. Because as I said, origins are important. And the origin story that we have in the Bible for how we came to be and how the earth came to be, we can take it at face value, and we can be appreciative of God's creative handiwork.